Chief de Cabinet, ESG Menendez, members of civil society, young people, friends, and colleagues. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today from all over the world. This is an important town hall with the Secretary General, which usually takes place during the annual session of the Commission and the Status of Women. We are grateful that even under these unusual conditions, the Secretary General has nevertheless prioritized this meeting with women, girls, non-binary persons, and young people. As you know, this year marks the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Platform for Action and the 20-year anniversary of the Security Council's Women, Peace and Security Agenda. The findings of the 25-year review of the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action had already put us on high alert that we are far from fulfilling the promises of Beijing. And now, the fallout from COVID-19 pandemic has made the challenges for women and girls even more acute. The shadow pandemic of violence against women has put the lives of many more women and girls at higher risk. It is much more important than ever before to work together in solidarity, to support one another, and to start to plan how we will build back better. The digital divide is keeping women and girls away from information and education, and this is a sure way of leaving them behind and reversing the modest but important gains we had made in girls' education. Women's unpaid care work has been rising. As millions of girls are out of school, they are at greater risk of being affected by harmful practices, as well as to drop out of school, and we risk another lost generation. The new normal must include the allocation of resources and mobilization of partners that are critical for us to rise up to this occasion and to seize the moment that this crisis presents. Together, we have highlighted these challenges. We have asked member states to make GBV interventions essential services in every country. We have asked member states and development finance institutions to structure fiscal packages accordingly in their pandemic response and to include the women such as those that are in the informal sector. These are the issues we are focusing in as we mark the 25 years of implementing the Beijing Platform for Action through generation equality, and we are grateful for your continued engagement. It is critical and it is urgent that we gear up for the Next Generation Forum, and we support the advocacy of all of you in your own country, but we are particularly grateful for the advocacy of the Secretary General and the Deputy Secretary General on all our behalf. And I thank you for listening. And at this point, I will give you just some housekeeping remarks, and then I will hand over to the Secretary General for these remarks. Please, after the Secretary General's opening remarks, we will open the floor for questions using the chat box functions that you will see on your screen. To raise a question, please identify yourself in the chat box, and if you wish, also enter your question there. We will select batches of 4 speakers at a time, and on basis of geographical, thematic, and generational diversity. We will aim to give space to those who are never likely to meet the Secretary General and give them an opportunity to have their say. The 4 of you at a time will be given an opportunity to speak and the answers will be given together. Please use the chat box. And unfortunately, we are unable to provide language or sign interpretation for this meeting due to technical limitations. We will try to resolve this in the future. Please keep your questions short and sharp, about 1 minute. Mr. Secretary General, it is now my pleasure to invite you to deliver your remarks.
Thank you very much, my dear colleague from Zilla. And dear friends, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. May I, before starting, say, you will have the chance to speak. Please do not limit yourself to ask questions. I'll be glad to try to answer any question that you ask, but my main interest is to listen to your opinions, to your suggestions, to your proposals, and to the critical aspects that you would like to raise about what we have been doing. So please use this as an opportunity to convey your own positions more than to ask questions. But of course, I'll be glad to try, if I can, to answer whatever question is asked. But my main objective is to listen, is not to talk. Now, it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you. This town hall on the sidelines of the Commission on the Status of Women is a regular feature in my calendar, and CSW itself is an annual landmark at the United Nations. This year, unfortunately, it was one of the first events to be postponed in response to COVID-19. And I'm glad to finally have the opportunity to meet with human civil society and to hear your ideas and concerns. The COVID-19 pandemic has, in the past 6 months, turned our world upside down. Beyond the virus itself, the response has had a disproportionate and devastating social and economic impact on women and girls. COVID-19 is deepening existing inequalities, including gender inequality. Already we are seeing a reversal in decades of limited and fragile progress on gender equality and women's rights. And without a concerted response, we risk losing a generation or more of gains. Since the start, women have been on the front lines of the response as healthcare workers, teachers, essential staff, and as carers in their families and communities. Between 70 and 90% of healthcare workers are women, but their salaries and conditions often fail to reflect the life-saving roles they occupy. Personal protective equipment is often made to fit a standard man, which means women care workers may be at greater risk of infection, and fewer than 30% of decision-making roles in the health sector are occupied by women. 70 to 90% of healthcare workers doing the work, but only 30% in decision-making roles. In the broader economy, the majority of women around the world are employed informally. Many have been thrown into financial insecurity by the pandemic, without regular income and lacking any social safety net. The pandemic has exposed the crisis in unpaid care work, which has increased exponentially as a result of school closures and the needs of older people, and falls disproportionately on women. Before the start of the pandemic, it was clear that care work, unpaid in the home and underpaid in the formal economy, has long been a contributing factor to gender inequality. Now the pandemic has exposed the extent of this impact on physical and mental health, education, and labor force participation. There are also disturbing reports from around the world of skyrocketing levels of gender-based violence, as many women are effectively confined with their abusers while resources and support services are redirected. In short, the pandemic is exposing and exacerbating the considerable hurdles women face in achieving their rights and fulfilling their potential. Progress lost may take years, even generations, to recover. We know from the Ebola outbreak in West Africa that when teenage girls have leave school, they may never return. Today, millions of teenage girls around the world are out of school, and there are alarming reports of an increase in teenage pregnancies in some countries. Each of these issues is a crisis within a crisis. Distinguished activists, protecting the rights of women and girls during this time is a top priority for the United Nations. We issued a policy brief in early April, calling on governments to take concrete action to put women and girls, their inclusion, representation, rights, social and economic outcomes, and protection at the center of all efforts to tackle and recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. The first phase is the health response. While statistics indicate that women and girls are at lower risk from the COVID-19 virus itself, they are suffering because of the redirection of health funding and services. It is simply counterproductive, for example, to deprioritize maternal and health services. Maternal mortality fell by nearly 40% between 2000 and 2017. We cannot backtrack now, but there are signs that rates are rising again due to the pandemic, particularly in countries in crisis. Governments must take a holistic view of the health impact of this pandemic. All women have a right to quality, affordable sexual and reproductive health services, and governments have a responsibility to make sure women and girls can access these services even during a crisis. In the longer term, we need health systems that meet the needs and realities of all, including women and girls. And this means prioritizing and funding primary health care and universal health coverage. We are also urging governments to prioritize protecting women from gender-based violence in their national COVID-19 plans. At the start of the pandemic, after my call for a global ceasefire, I issued an appeal for an end to all violence everywhere, from war zones to people zones, so that we can face this pandemic together in solidarity. I was heartened by the response. More than 140 governments committed to taking action to designate women's shelters as essential and to continue and expand online services. The United Nations stands ready to support these efforts around the world. We already have a well-established partnership with the European Union, the Spotlight Initiative, which is the largest global platform on ending violence against women and girls. Through these, we stand ready to support countries to uphold their commitments to inclusive peace and security. The second phase of the response is mitigating the social and economic impact of the crisis. That starts with putting money into the hands of women who work in both the formal and informal economies. Cash transfers, credits, and loans should be targeted at women to mitigate the immediate impact of job losses and increased caring responsibilities. As governments inject stimulus and other funds to get their economies back to work, they must expand social safety nets and recognize the value of invisible and unpaid care work. These will address the vulnerabilities women experience, ensure women's central role in economic life, and in the long term, contribute to sustainable development and more inclusive and resilient economies. The third phase of the response is building a better future. The pandemic is only demonstrating what we all know. The millennia of patriarchy have resulted in a male-dominated world with a male-dominated culture which damages everyone, women, men, girls, and boys. I've many times said that behind many of the problems I've been talking about, there is an essential question of power. And it is indeed addressing this question of power that we must concentrate all our efforts. It is clear that we cannot go back to the failed policies that have resulted in the fragility we see around us, in healthcare systems, in social protection, in access to justice. This is the time to rebuild more equal, inclusive, and resilient societies. Our roadmap is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We need to take the opportunity of an economic reset to ensure the rights to life, dignity, and security for everyone. The pandemic has shown us who is doing the work that really matters: nurses, teachers, care workers. As we recover, we need to remember these. It is time to end the inequalities of unpaid care work and create new economic models that work for everyone. Benefits like health insurance, paid sick leave, paid child and family care, and paid parental leave are not luxuries. They are vital to the functioning of our societies. Extending those inevitably has a gender dimension because so much of the work women do is underpaid and undervalued. Recovering better goes beyond governments. The private sector, academia, institutions of all kinds, and civil society must be fully engaged. It's essential to protect and expand civic space so that civil society organizations can play their full part. And we must also emerge from the crisis with women's equal leadership and representation. The past months have seen a growing recognition in the media and through academic research, highlighting what we have known anecdotally for years, that women leaders are extremely effective. Women heads of state, ministers of health, health workers, and community leaders are winning widespread recognition for their empathy, compassion, communication, and evidence-based decision-making. Their actions are showing the value of inclusivity. It stands to reason, doubling the resources, capacity, and expertise we put into decision-making benefits everyone. And yet, less than 8% of heads of state, less than 25% of parliamentarians, and less than 30% of decision makers on healthcare are women. Bias and discrimination are harming us all. And again, this is essentially a question of power. That is why I made bringing more women into leadership positions in the United Nations one of my first priorities. I'm proud that we achieved gender parity at the beginning of 2020 with 90 women and 90 men as full-time senior leaders, 2 years ahead of the target date I had set. We have a roadmap in place for gender parity at all levels of the United Nations in the coming years, and I will push hard for its implementation. We owe this not only to our women staff, but to the people we serve. Organizations and companies that include equal numbers of women at all levels are more effective, efficient, and resilient to sudden shocks. This is also why I've made temporary special measures a signature issue of my call of action on human rights. Unless we use quotas and temporary special measures to remove the biases and obstacles to women's equal participation, women will never realize their full rights and societies will never reap the benefits of equality and inclusion. Dear advocates, while the COVID-19 pandemic is at the top of all concerns, we will not be distracted from all our other goals. This year is an important one for gender equality, marking the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration, the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and the first year of the Decade of Action on the Sustainable Development Goals. In February, I set out our priorities and agenda in a speech on women and power at the New School here in New York. We remain determined to advance women's priorities and to ensure their equal rights and participation in the peace and security agenda, on climate change, on building inclusive economies, and on reducing and eliminating the digital divide so that women have an equal role in designing the technologies of the future. Dear activists, dear friends, we are going through difficult times, and nobody expects them to end soon. But I want to reassure you, and through you women everywhere, that the United Nations stands with you and is working for you every day around the world. As we mark our 75th anniversary, we need your voices and engagement more than ever. The United Nations is changing, and we count on you to be part of that change. In the past 75 years, we have seen successive waves of advocacy for human rights and women's rights. Today, young women like Nadia Murad and Malala are redefining leadership for a new generation. At a time of growing nationalism and populism, the forces ranged against global solidarity can seem overwhelming. But if we are to meet today's global challenges, from the climate crisis to growing inequality and the digital divide, we must join together, rejecting sexist and ageist stereotypes that prevent women and men from realizing our full humanity. I invite you to join us, and I promise you that we will listen. Today, as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm here with the main objective of listening, and I look forward to hearing your views. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. We have a few questions, but may I start by asking you if you have a special request from civil society, a role they can play alongside you as you intend to highlight the issue of gender-based violence. How can they make sure that we adopt even new ways of working in order to make sure that we heightened the urgency of the matter? And then, of course, I will then ask Daniela from Ghana to ask the question, and Martha from Poland also to ask the questions, and then followed by Nino from Georgia. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Daniela from Ghana. So a few weeks ago, even in this pandemic, a 90-year-old woman was beaten to death on the ticket that she was a witch in Ghana. For all I know, generally, witch camps have been in existence in my country for as long as I know. I believe that there are a lot more of these witch camps in other African countries. My suggestion is that arrangement for the many African women who are possibly also being tortured on the ticket of witchcraft. That would be good. But I would also want to know that is the of this problem, and if so, what are the arrangements being made towards it? Thank you.
I'm terribly sorry, but the sound is very bad. Do you mind slowly but very explicitly put the central question that you have raised? Because I couldn't understand.
Okay, so my question is that in which camps?
Sorry, but there was no sound. There was an interruption of the sound. Do you mind starting again?
I'm so sorry. I'm very sorry about that. But then I am asking
it's
that...
It's not your problem. It's the problem of the system.
Okay. But then I'm asking that, are there any arrangements being made for African women who are being tortured in witch camps? Because not so long ago, a 90-year-old grandmother was beaten to death here in Ghana because she's claimed to be a witch in a witch camp. So I am asking that, is the SG aware of this problem? And if so, what are the considerations being made towards this problem? If not, then I am suggesting that, if possible, then some arrangement should be made for this problem. I hope it's clearer now.
Essential question, SG, is about witchcraft.
Yes,
and
yes,
what it is.
I understood.
Oh.
I understood.
Thank you. Then please, Martha. Unmute.
Hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Should I start over? Because I couldn't hear myself, so I'm not sure if it's working.
It's working fine. Please continue with your intervention. Everything is fine. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So I just cannot hear myself. Okay, I'm from the Polish Women's Strike. It's a coalition of women that organized protests in 2016 against the ban on abortion that was being introduced in Poland, but we won, and it actually didn't pass. And we work in 150 cities in Poland, and we've been doing everything for the last 4 years. But as we do everything about women's rights and LGBT persons' rights. We support persons with disabilities, and we basically came to the conclusion that what we're dealing with in Poland and in Europe, which we never thought that we would be dealing with, I guess, it's a major crisis on human rights now, and a major attack on human rights system. And having populist or right-wing governments, or the governments that are based on this authoritarian narrative of just one true nation, one true narrative, and so on, it doesn't only affect the pillars of democracy, the institutions of the countries like Poland, like Hungary, like everywhere in all of Europe, because it will come everywhere, it will happen everywhere. But it basically touches all the human rights system, and the groups that are working in Poland, but in many other countries, the fundamentalist groups, the populist groups, are the ones who undermine all the human rights something that we worked for and something that we've had for so many years and something that we here especially thought that we had granted, and now we just see it slipping away. So, of course, we talk here about women's rights, but my point is, and my question is, do we acknowledge that we have this huge wave against human rights in all the countries, all over the world, and do we see the women are the ones very often leading the fight against this? And what can we do about it? Because we're not facing a progress, we are facing a backlash, a huge backlash, and the whole human rights system, the system that we're used to, the system that we adopted so many years ago, it's crashing in our eyes, and I see that happening. And this is overwhelming, really, to have to fight this every day, to have to fight this on daily basis. But do we have an idea how to help each other, how to help other people acknowledge it, that we are facing this problem? So this is not only women's rights issue, but it's also human rights issue, as women's rights are human rights. And how can we organize around this?
Thank you, Martha.
To say that we're in a crisis.
Thank you. Thank you, Martha. And then we go on to Nino.
Hello. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Secretary, esteemed panelists. Indeed, as you rightfully outlined, women have really been on the front lines of the COVID response, and it has once again showed us how much of the work that women do, both within the medical industry, has been undervalued and under-respected. Actually, 45 hours is an amount of time in Georgia that a woman spends on household duties per week. This is equal to the full-time job, while women are undertaking full-time jobs and where they're also securing for the families. And it's not surprising during the pandemic, of course, with the kids at home, with all this additional domestic work, it has really been even more challenging for women. So while we are trying to unpack what a pandemic has caused, I think it's important for us to once again understand the invisible barriers that women are facing for their economic empowerment. Because how could we talk about women having enough time to work, enough time to advance themselves career-wise if they're spending 45 hours per week and additional full-time job in a household duties when, in Georgia, according to the UN Women's Survey, men just only sharing 3 times less of the workload. So how can we, as this is an example of one country, but I assume it's not only happening in Georgia. So how can we, as a global community, try to advocate more on the issues that are not on the surface, that are just part of the culture or that are part of the gender role that we need?
Thank you, Nino. Thank you. The last question in this group is Shannon. Shannon, please try and be sharp and short.
I will be. Thank you, Phumzile. Secretary General, thank you so much for your leadership on including gender equality and human rights-based responses as the center of the response to COVID-19. We really appreciate it. And we also appreciate your calls for ensuring essential access to sexual and reproductive health services throughout this time. But as you know, many of the attacks that women and girls and gender non-conforming people are facing are being amplified by this pandemic. And some governments, as we just heard from Poland and the US, are using this as an opportunity to further restrict access to abortion, to comprehensive sexuality education and gender-affirming treatment. And we all know that the impacts of these kinds of actions fall hardest on LGBTI women, on Black, Afro-descendant, Indigenous women, and women of other racial minorities, women with disabilities, and others who face social marginalization. And we also know that a lot of these things require systemic responses, especially when it comes to maintaining access to contraceptives, for example, at a time when the global supply chains are at risk. So my question to you is, what are you doing to coordinate systemic responses to some of these issues, and how can the UN and your office in particular not just take on the issue of access to services, but protection of these critical rights? Thank you.
Back to you, Secretary General.
Well, thank you very much for your testimonies and your questions. First of all, in relation to civil society, there are two aspects. One is what we can do in our work, both at global level and at country level, to push for civil society voice to be heard, to make sure that we ask governments to have mechanisms of participation, and even through the different funding mechanisms, unfortunately relatively small, like the Women, Peace and Humanitarian Fund of the Peace Building Fund, or the Spotlight Initiative, to try to support directly some civil society organization. But this is just a drop in the ocean. The central question for me is again a question of power. The UN is an intergovernmental organization, and the big battle that we are having is member states want to keep it as an intergovernmental organization. I've been saying that one of the aspects of the reform of the UN that is necessary is to make it a much more inclusive organization, which means that not only governments, but also cities, also the business community, the civil society, the youth, must have institutional forms to participate in UN decisions, and the same must apply at country level according to the democratic institutions where they exist, or at least to the other forms of participation that can be envisaged in less democratic regimes. The central question for me is a question of redistributing of power. Again, I have been influenced in my youth by a German philosopher, Habermas, and in his opinion, what is typical of a modern democracy, or one of the things typical of modern democracy, is the permanent flow of intercommunication between civil society and political society, and the fact that that has an influence on political decisions. And this is what we fight for. And it's a battle that is not won, because there is a pushback against this redistribution of power, and many governments want to keep the UN and other international organizations as strictly intergovernmental. But we will be very much committed to make sure that the civil society will have a growing role in decision-making at national level and at global level. The witchcraft problem is indeed a problem that remains. We have been following closely that information, and our country teams have very specific recommendations to support governments in implementing programs to make sure that the campaigns against witchcraft and the other things that are still taking place and that remind us of centuries ago are put an end to it. So it's clearly a matter of, I would say, extreme forms of discrimination and of exclusion that must be eradicated in every society, and our country teams are working closely to make sure that governments do it. The distinguished friend from Poland, I think there are two dimensions that we are very much worried about. One is the general dimension, the pushback against human rights in general, the emergence of populism, of nationalism, of the so-called robust democracies, to use a funny expression that unfortunately is not funny at all, and the fact that this is undermining human rights in general in many societies around the world. And this is the reason why we have launched the Call for Action on Human Rights, and we have a number of important initiatives in all aspects, and namely in relation to the protection of the civic space, the freedom of press, the freedom of demonstrations, etc., and many other areas of which we have initiatives, and we are asking also our country teams and the Human Rights Council to have a very active role and a very active engagement in all these aspects, fighting back, pushing back in human rights. But one of the dimensions is indeed patriarchy. The patriarchy, the reverse or the strengthening of patriarchy. And we see that if one looks at the two things that we are commemorating this year, the Women's Peace and Security Resolution, there has been no real progress on the ground. And the Beijing Program of Action, there is a clear pushback. And I think it's essential to push back on the pushback, and it's essential to fight this patriarchy strengthening. And as I said, this is essentially a question of power. In a recent intervention I did about inequality in the Nelson Mandela conference, I referred patriarchy and colonialism as two things that are still present in today's world with their impact. And I think we need to be very active in making sure that we push back against this pushback, and we mobilize the whole of the UN system, and we mobilize all the civil society organizations that work with us, that we mobilize all our allies in government systems, in political systems, that we mobilize also the business community to make them understand that this patriarchy is a main obstacle not only to the expression of human rights, but it is a main obstacle to the development of our societies from an inclusive and sustainable way. Now, the question that was raised by our friend Nina, I believe unpaid work, especially in the informal sectors, and or underpaid work in the informal sectors, and unpaid work in care are indeed two aspects of inequality that are particularly relevant. And we believe that here the COVID might be an opportunity, and that's why we have been insisting in all our policy briefings, and in particular in relation to the aspects of the defining of the relief packages that governments need to put in place, the need to address both the questions of underpaid informal work, because informal sectors are, I would say, more impacted than formal sectors, and we see, and more difficult to respond, and in relation to finally take into account the unpaid care work that is immensely increased with the COVID. So these must be an opportunity, and in all our guidance given to governments, both at global level in our policy briefs and with the platforms that country teams are establishing, this is considered to be a priority, and also to use women as the point of destination of many of the subsidies or different other aspects and relief packages that are distributed. I remember my experiences when I Commissioner for Refugees, when we were talking about microcredit. Microcredit given to women had a much more positive impact than microcredit given to men. So this is the kind of things that demonstrate that having women, the way to channel these relief packages is a good thing for both women's equality, but also for the countries themselves. Now, it is clear that we are witnessing a very strong attack on all the progresses made after Beijing, and actually in relation to sexual and reproductive health. And I've been putting this in all my interventions, and we have been putting this in all our policy briefs and also in the country teams' works to make sure that governments do not take profit of the COVID-19 to undermine the rights in sexual and reproductive rights, and to put into question the services that are provided. So this is indeed a matter of priority, and I fully agree that the questions of discrimination that you mentioned, be it in relation to LGBTI, in relation to disability or indigenous peoples, have been dramatically impacted by the COVID. The COVID has been a factor to increase discrimination, and we need to put things exactly on the reverse. We need to do all the measures to respond to COVID and to respond to the economic and social impacts of COVID as an opportunity to fight discrimination and to push back against this terrible pushback that we are witnessing, and in which discrimination indeed is increasing, and basic rights, namely the sexual and reproductive rights, are being put into question.
Thank you, Secretary General. Let me just answer Daniela's question about the harmful cultural practices such as witchcraft that she raised, and if the UN is doing anything about it. In general, we fight against all cultural practices that discriminate and harm women. Child marriage would fall under those practices, but extreme practices such as banning women because of being suspected for witchcraft, we are taking these issues to traditional leaders. Just this morning, we were in a half-a-day's conference with a Pan-African group of traditional leaders in Africa called COLTA. And you may be interested to know that that organization is headquartered in Nigeria. And we're working with them all over Africa to address these issues. And we can only re-emphasize this issue now that we have also raised it. So thank you for that question. We will now move on to the next set of questions. We have Shannon. No, Shannon, we've been Ellen, who is coming. And we also have Audrey from Zimbabwe. And then the other questions I will read because they're in the chat book. So let me ask those two to state their questions. Ellen? Ellen, can you log in?
And we're looking for her now. Could you go to the next one, please, while we look for the map?
Okay. Audrey in Zimbabwe, you are asking about teen pregnancy. Audrey's question, if I may then read it, is that we have so many girls who have become pregnant during this phase when many were out of school. This is, as the SJ said earlier, it's a pandemic within a pandemic. Is there a specific strategy for the UN to address this issue? Another question in the chat box is from Esther from Oman, who is asking about the support for human rights defenders, who are usually the people that are well known in their communities and trusted. Is there anything we can do to defend better these women peace builders? We actually also have another question, which is asking about the increase of the attack and rejection of multilateralism, which is attacking institutions such as UNFPA, WHO, and UN Women. All of these institutions are close to gender equality. At the same time, the United Nations is being questioned whether it is fit for purpose. And she is asking is there anything we're doing to address the global system so that on one hand, we can decrease the attack on the multilateralism and support the organizations who are under attack, and at the same time ensure that the UN itself is fit for purpose. Thank you. Over, SG.
Well, first of all, in relation to early pregnancy, indeed, with so many young women, so many teenagers out of school, we have now clear indications that the numbers of early pregnancy are again on the rise after a meaningful decrease in the past years. That is the reason why in our policy brief on education, we have insisted how important it is to reestablish as soon as possible, and with naturally all the care measures that are necessary, but to reestablish as soon as possible the school system working. This is, for me, a very important priority. We know that it cannot be done without precaution. We know that we need to take into account all the health problems related to COVID, but to have the school systems reopen is extremely, extremely important. So this should be a priority, taking all the measures necessary to create the conditions for that to be possible. On the other hand, there are a number of other aspects related to health policies, related to community support, in which we have been trying to convince governments to act in order to reduce the impacts of school closures. And obviously, this is one of the aspects to be taken into account. But I would say the most important is to reestablish as soon as possible the normal work of our school systems. Now, in the call for action that I presented on human rights, the protection of human rights defenders is a key priority. And we see human rights defenders being under attack on different areas, but also on, of course, the gender dimension. I issue every year a report on violations against human rights defenders, a report that is every year issued, and in which we underline not only the generic aspects, but the concrete violations that exist in different parts of the world. And we will go on doing so, both denouncing the violations, but also asking, both in relation to the call for action and in relation to the activities of our country teams, to be very active in relation to the protection of human rights defenders. Now, the attack against multilateralism. It is clear that we are witnessing, as it was mentioned by our friend from Poland, an increase in nationalism, an increase in populism, and many saying that we don't need multilateral organizations. What we need is each country to do it by itself and to solve the problems of the country and forget about the rest. Now, there are, of course, things that we can do, and one of the important things is the reform of the UN to make it more effective, more cost-effective, more linked to the aspirations of the people, more directly linked to the interests of the people, and not, avoiding sometimes these bureaucratic trends that exist in all international organizations. And we are doing it, and we are pushing for it, and we also are claiming the need to reform other institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, the composition of the bodies of the UN, etc. But independently of that, I think we need to fight ideologically, and to fight ideologically, calling the attention of people to the enormous fragilities of our world. We are on our knees because of a microscopic virus. And we have seen that with each country doing it by itself, it has been total chaos around the world, and the virus moving from east to west, and then from north to south, and with the risks of coming back, and with other waves, and total discoordination, because the World Health Organization has not the power to impose coordination. They can only give advice to government. So if we have anything is not too much multilateralism, is not enough multilateralism. On the other hand, we see the fragility in relation to climate change. We see lawlessness in the cyberspace. We see the fragilities of inequality in our societies. And all these can only be answered if we come together. All this can only be answered if we understand that we are on this together, and we can come out of the COVID and other threats together. And all this requires mechanisms of global governance. All this requires effective international cooperation and coordination. And that is not possible without strengthening the multilateral institutions. So we need to, this is a battle to fight, an ideological battle to fight against those that think that they can solve problems by themselves. It is clear it's not possible. The threats, the challenges of the world, the fragility of our planet is such that without more global governance, more multilateralism, more international cooperation, we will be doomed. And we need to fight this battle, and the civil society has a key role to play in this regard.
Thank you. Thank you, General Secretary. And the next questions, three people, Joan Padlo, Wendy Morales, and Audrey Charamba. Please, if you could be ready, starting with Juan Pablo.
Hello, I'm Juan Pablo from Argentina. I'm member of the Beijing Plus 25 Youth Task Force. Very nice to meet the Secretary General. My question is about youth-led organizations. We know that young people have been a crucial actor in the COVID-19 response, but we also know that most of us are in crisis, in financial crisis, personally, and also our organizations. Most of us do voluntary work, even inside the United Nations system, and also our organizations, most of them don't have a legal status, so it's so hard to access to funds and budgeting. So my question is if there are any concrete action or proposal to support our organizations. Thank you very much.
Wendy Morales.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Wendy Morales. I'm from El Salvador. My organization is Azul Originario. And sorry, but my English is not good. My question is,
you can speak Spanish if you want, because I understand Spanish.
Ah, bueno, muchas gracias. Bueno, mi pregunta era, ¿de qué forma la sociedad civil puede involucrarse de manera más directa para garantizar que las acciones lleguen a los territorios? Porque muchas veces se hace a través de los gobiernos y esto no logra bajar hasta los territorios. Entonces, ¿cuál podría ser el canal para que las organizaciones de sociedad civil podamos tener un contacto más directo con Naciones Unidas? Thank you.
Audrey Charamba, Zimbabwe. Come on, Zim.
Trying to unmute.
Okay. You can unmute yourself.
God, it's
Okay,
refusing.
she's good to go. Audrey, you're fine. Just speak. I'll get your microphone for you. Audrey, please, your extension's ready to go. Audrey, go. Thank you.
Can I speak now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Very well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Phumzile, for your patience with me and this technology. Thank you, SG, for all this information and the interactive platform that we are having. So as we are struggling to end violence against women and to promote gender equality, yes, this COVID-19 is a new dynamic which has actually brought a lot of challenges. We have a lot of young people here who are out of school, not for any reason other than the COVID-19 pandemic. And so they have no access to online technologies, and therefore they cannot, only a limited number of young people are able to participate in online learning. And this has resulted in an increase, a surge, I would say, in unplanned teenage pregnancies. We can see this going on for quite a while. And we know that women are frontline defenders in the response. Yet, the sources of income for their livelihoods have also been curtailed. Now, as the UN, in the broad plan of ensuring that we are mitigating violence against women and appreciating that violence against women and poverty are twin epidemics, what ideas might you be having that we can already be thinking through in line with the context that COVID-19 is here with us for quite a while? And in that same breath, I also want to just find out if, as the UN, you have also been able in different regional and in-country offices to realize the 50-50 gender equality clause that we are also advocating for in the different spaces that we occupy. Thank you.
Okay. The Secretary General partially answered that question before that. I hope you picked that up. So maybe he will not be too long on it again. But Ellen from Georgia, please. Ellen from Georgia.
Ma'am, she's not here. Please, could you go to the next one? Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. I have a question from the chat box on how we could support young health professionals to participate more actively to provide services in health institutions where they see the rights of patients being violated and sometimes even the rights of health workers. They feel that as young professionals, they are not finding their space within the health professional. We also have another question, which is from a disability activist who is asking about how the United Nations is pushing and working to support the inclusion of disabled people in all aspects of life and working with member states and other institutions. Thank you. Over.
Well, first of all, to our friend Juan Pablo from Argentina, one thing that is clear in today's world is that if there is a reason to be hopeful, it has to do with the attitudes of young people. Young people has been leading very important campaigns around the world in relation to climate change. It is obvious the leadership of young people. Young people have been leading many other aspects related to human rights, to women's rights. And the question is, how can we work in order to support young people's organizations and in order to support the young people's participation in our institutions? Now, this is where I believe the central question is the one that was related to what to my first answer. We need to create mechanisms in societies at national level and at global level to institutionalize the presence of young people and their organizations in decision-making processes, and also have young people organizations properly funded. As I said, we have our own mechanisms of funding for that, but they are extremely reduced. And we are pushing with our country teams to make governments understand how important it is to support young people's organizations. But we need something more. We need political systems to recognize and international organizations to recognize that there must be institutional forms of participation in young people, and that there must be a bigger weight of young people in the institutions themselves. For instance, young people presence in parliaments, young people presence in governments, young people, and we are seeing some very interesting experiences in some countries that are doing it with very, very good results. So this is an area of great interest for us, and whatever we can do to strengthen the determination of civil societies and governments to push in this direction, we will consider a priority. Now, a la pregunta de nuestra amiga Wendy Morales, yo creo que es muy importante pasar del nivel global, del nivel nacional, al nivel de las ciudades, de los distritos, de los territorios. Y ahí yo creo que sería fundamental una alianza entre la sociedad civil y las autoridades locales. Nos vemos que en las Naciones Unidas el mismo problema que yo refería sobre una participación insuficiente institucional de la sociedad civil también es real en relación con las ciudades y con las regiones. Yo creo que habría que hacer una alianza entre poder local y sociedad civil para garantizar que las políticas que son definidas al nivel nacional tengan una incorporación de las prioridades de los territorios, que los territorios tengan una voz en la definición de las políticas y que después las políticas se apliquen no solamente al nivel nacional, pero al terreno, en profundidad, a las comunidades en los distintos territorios del país. To the question raised by Audrey, first of all, we have several kinds of problems. We have schools closed, and it would be very important, as I mentioned, to do everything possible to create the conditions to safely open schools. But we have a dramatic digital divide. We have very few schools in Africa linked to the internet. And one of our programs, and the program that we are mobilizing the business community to do it, is to make sure that in 2030, we'll have all schools in the world, and UNICEF leads this process, all schools in the world linked to the internet. And at the same time, a very important push in our action in relation to the digital technologies to make the whole world accept, and this was one of the recommendations of the high-level panel that I made, the whole world accept that a priority must be universal internet coverage as soon as possible, and this will of course facilitate the possibility of having schools operating online in the developing world. But then, independently of that, I think it's very important to do everything to support girls outside school and to make community measures active in order to make sure that we avoid the questions that were mentioned already several times in this debate. Now, the 50-50 is not at senior management. At the present moment, in our resident coordinators, which are the leaders of our operations in all countries of the world, we are already at 50-50, men and women. We were at about 40 just a few years ago. And we are also moving into also more effective regional diversity, less predominance of the traditional presence of Western European and others related to Western Europeans. So gender equality and equitable regional distribution is a priority everywhere, and also progressively, I hope, all agencies have their own programs, and this should be done at country level and at national level by everybody, everywhere. And we have 2028 as the target date, and especially it's particularly difficult in the missions, peacekeeping missions and others, but as the target date to have gender parity across the board in all UN activities in the world. Now, in relation to young health professionals, this has been essentially a main concern of the World Health Organization. They have been working hard through their country teams, through their country offices, in order to support governments to provide young health professionals with the same conditions, and at the same time to give them a voice in relation to the policies and to the measures that are taken. So this is indeed a priority the World Health Organization has been fully assuming. And in relation to the people with disabilities, one of the most important policy briefs that we have published, and with the support of our country teams, we are trying to make sure that all governments in the world take this seriously into account, is in relation to how to address in a COVID-19 situation the discrimination against people with disabilities, using the COVID-19 as an opportunity to reduce discrimination and to create conditions of effective integration and equality in relation to people with disabilities. This policy brief is available everywhere, and the country teams have clear instructions to include it in the national programs that they have, and to convince governments to include it in their own national programs.
Very much. I am afraid, as usual, we have run out of time, so we will not be able to answer all the questions. But let me just highlight some of the important questions, SG, that I think it may be important that you touch on. A question about white supremacy and the culture of racism in the world. How can the UN and how is the UN helping to deconstruct systemic racism? We also have a question from a colleague on LGBTQI who is asking about the support of the UN for this community, which is facing immense pressure, including violence. How can we support them in their different countries and in society in general? I'm afraid we will have to end it there, and then we will have SG closing remarks. Over to you, SG.
Well, the question of racism is unfortunately a dramatic social disease that is still very strong everywhere. And, I mean, it's not only in one or two countries, it's everywhere. And fight against racism must be our fundamental priority. Fight against racism ideologically, fighting racist organizations, fighting their arguments, fighting white supremacists, but at the same time addressing root causes and investing in the social cohesion in societies, investing in ways to make all communities in a society feel their identities are respected, but they are part of the society as a whole, and investing in the conditions that will make racism much less easy to prevail. At the same time, we have now, and I've asked for a roadmap to address racism inside the UN, because also inside any organization, we still have racist manifestations that need to be fought in a very strong, determined way. Racism is absolutely unacceptable. Racism is the denial of humanity, and racism is a disease, a social disease that needs to be eradicated. Now, the LGBTI I already mentioned. I mean, in the call of action for human rights, this is one of our priorities. It is true that the discrimination against the people has increased with the COVID-19, and we are asking all our country teams to detect situations and to be actively engaged in advocacy and in support to the communities in order to make sure that we minimize all the negative impacts of the COVID-19 in the discrimination against LGBTI people. So this is indeed one of the priorities of our fight for equality, one of our priorities of our fight for inclusivity in the way we address the disease and in the way we program the response, economic, social, and human rights response to the disease.
Thank you, SG. Unfortunately, as I said, we have run out of time. I will now invite DSG to give us closing remarks. BJ, please unmute. Okay.
Yes, I've unmuted. I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Phumzile. Thank you, Secretary General. This has been an incredible discussion and a lot of learning for the UN from the concerns that you've put forward. The Secretary General has really set the scene, and all I can do is amplify. Just a reminder that before COVID, we were off track. And what we need to do is to use COVID to get back on track and to do things differently, especially as we celebrate the efforts that have been made for Beijing +25 on women, peace and security, that we need to do things differently and we need to amplify the inclusive multilateralism that the SG has talked about. We have coming up the UN at 75, we have the Decade of Action, and for us this really should put a focus on the intergenerational transition that needs to happen for issues that the SG has raised, for results of people and planet, for our institutions seeing much more of the inclusion of young people and of representation of the issues, and of course our leaders. Human rights is at the center of this, but we really need to look at the human rights outcomes. We need to track them, see the gaps, and just alluding to what the SG had said right at the end, racism, LGBTI, the leave no one behind mantra is very important for us to better define who the no ones are. Who are we leaving behind? Data will be a big issue for this, and we look forward to your partnering with us on it. We've spoken about financing and technology. These two pieces are an incredible part of what we talk about when we invest in the power relations and empowerment. Without the empowerment, we will continue to find ourselves lifting heavier and heavier a constituency of poor people than we would have otherwise wished for. So it's really important that we look at the power dynamics, but we also look at the investments in empowering women. The UN at the country level will continue to convene to amplify voice through our country teams and our partnerships, the representation of people. Obviously, in good democracies where we have got representation, it will be more about the issues, but where we don't have representation, we really need to see how we can open those spaces where the UN can create the opportunities for civil society to speak with government, to speak with business, to speak with all those that will generate a result in the actions that we require for the decade on the Sustainable Development Goals. New partnerships. We need to examine partnerships and better define the relationship between the two. And how do we do that with many more coming on, as we have had success over the last decade or so, 2 decades, with those partnerships broadening and different people coming into that space. We need to acknowledge that and to deepen those partnerships. We have to remember that this is a member state organization. And so we have to leverage the opportunities we have at the local and the global and the regional levels. And we're talking a much more inclusive, but let inclusion of member state organizations also start at the country level, where we can begin to feed the policies and to feed the feedback on the global frameworks that we have, so that it's not just top down. We also need to feed our platforms at the global level. The focus that the SG has put on this year's coming together at the GA, beyond the UN at 75, for the SDG moment, has been poverty and inequality, gender and climate. All of this you are an integral part of, and we will see your voices come through at the country dialogues, more importantly within the context of the socioeconomic response and recovery, through the policy briefs that we've had, and I think that through the moment when stakeholders will speak. Finally, our commitment has always been to convene, to ensure that the policy frameworks and the checks and balances are there to give us a more peaceful world that does have prosperity and human rights at the center. It would be really good for us to hear from you what it is you think we can do better than we're already doing, or areas where things are not happening, because this is about a two-way traffic. It is what we can learn from you, what we can convene to do. What we didn't hear so much of is what you think we should be doing, given that you are in the local environment, and that you have experienced much of what we speak about in the international community, of gaps, of exclusion, of not being there. We'll continue to advocate and convene for those spaces to be opened up. We will ask you to help us with the voice that needs to be amplified with our member states, but in a new era of a medium that perhaps traditional media doesn't quite do. How do we deal with the new medium of communication? It's obviously a challenge to all of us, because we are not hearing enough of the efforts that are being made, so that we can generate a sense of success, which obviously amplifies the can-do spirit that we need for this. Our focus will be on young people and the intergenerational transition that must happen. The UN is reforming to deal with the priorities of countries, and those countries include you. So how we strengthen that process to make sure that you're part of it will be a challenge to us, but as a whole. So thank you, SG and Phumzile, for making the opportunity for me to lend my voice to what women can do in leadership, and also to thank the SG for opening up the space for showing that women's leadership across constituencies, as I would say, from the inside out, from the UN to the outside, in amplifying the voice of women in leadership. Thank you.
Thank you, DSG. Thank you, SG. Thank you for making sure that this date that you have every year with civil society was kept no matter what, because it was really important for the women to have this opportunity and platform where they can hear their voice. I don't think that any one of us would have thought that at this time we would be living in a world like this. So it's reassuring to hear from you. I also want to assure the audience, especially those who are unable to speak, that you can still write to us and we'll try and answer your questions. But in particular, on the issue of shrinking space in the UN, as you see, the SG is committed, or the SG is committed to make sure that we work towards making decision-making in the United Nations inclusive and creating space for civil society. Generation equality is that model. We are trying it. We need you to be active so that if it works, it hopefully will have a positive impact throughout the UN. And lastly, I also like to thank the many young people who participated today. It's good to hear your voice. We are seeing more and more that young people are making sure that the 25 years of Beijing is an intergenerational moment in every way, and they insist in co-creating every step of the way. Thank you for that spirit, and thank you so much, SD and DSG, and goodbye to everybody.